The night was alive with soft golden lights shining across the luxury restaurant. Tables glittered with glassware, and guests whispered in low voices while music played gently in the background. The place was a world of wealth and power, and inside this world walked Emily, a young waitress with gentle eyes and quiet steps. She wore the plain uniform of the restaurant, her hair tied back neatly, her smile polite and calm. But behind her smile was a secret. Emily could not speak. Her voice had been silent since birth, and so she lived her life through sign language, speaking with her hands and her eyes, carrying dignity in every small movement she made. The guests who came here were rich and proud. Some looked at her with kindness, but most barely noticed her. To them, she was only part of the background, someone to carry plates and clean tables. Yet Emily never let this treatment break her spirit. She worked hard, she stayed patient, and she knew that her silence was not weakness. It was a strength she carried with grace. Every day she told herself that even in a room full of noise, her hands could speak louder than words. On this particular evening, the doors of the restaurant opened with force, and a tall figure walked in. It was Alexander King, the billionaire whose name was known in every business paper. He was famous for his wealth and his arrogance. People called him powerful, but others whispered about his pride and cruelty. He never entered a room quietly. His presence demanded attention, and soon the entire restaurant turned to look at him. Alexander wore a dark tailored suit. His watch sparkled under the lights. His steps were slow but commanding, as if the ground itself bowed before him. He was not alone. With him came a group of business partners, men and women dressed in suits, each one smiling too much, eager to please him. They followed him like shadows, and together they took a large table in the center of the restaurant. Laughter and loud voices filled the air as they sat. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room like a king looking at his court. And then those eyes landed on Emily. Emily walked toward the table carrying a tray of drinks. Her step steady, though her heart beat faster under his gaze. She set the glasses down with care, her movements quiet but graceful. She did not speak. Instead, she nodded politely and raised her hands to sign thank you. One of the business partners frowned in confusion. Alexander noticed the sign, his eyebrows lifted, and a small smirk touched his lips. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand as if he had found a new form of amusement. The billionaire's voice carried loudly across the room. "Who is this girl who does not answer me?" he said with mock curiosity. "Does she not know who I am?" The table chuckled at his words. Emily kept her calm face, though inside she felt a familiar sting. She raised her hands again and signed slowly, her fingers moving with quiet elegance. But Alexander only narrowed his eyes, then leaned closer to his companions, whispering something that made them laugh even louder. The sound felt sharp against the quiet music. The restaurant grew tense. Nearby guests began to notice the scene. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Eyes turned toward Emily and Alexander. There was a silence building underneath the laughter, as if everyone sensed something cruel was about to happen. Alexander tapped the table with one hand and called out, "Young lady, are you unable to speak?" His words were exaggerated, loud, almost theatrical, his tone dripping with false pity. His companions laughed again, their voices echoing too harshly in the golden room. Emily stood still, her tray pressed against her side, her face pale but her eyes steady. She did not bow, she did not run. Instead, she signed again, her movement slower this time, deliberate, her hands telling a truth that needed no sound. But Alexander pretended not to understand. He waved his hand as if swatting away meaningless gestures. The smirk on his lips widened. He looked around the restaurant, making sure everyone was watching, his pride feeding on the spotlight, his arrogance growing with each passing second. Inside Emily's chest, her heart pounded, anger and shame twisted together. She had been silent her whole life, but never before had her silence been turned into a weapon against her. Never had someone so boldly tried to strip her dignity in front of strangers. Yet she held her head high, her eyes fierce even as her body trembled. She knew something important. She knew that silence could be stronger than noise. She knew that a single moment could change everything. And though she had not yet spoken back, the fire in her spirit promised that she would. The restaurant now felt like a stage, with Emily and Alexander standing as actors in a play that none of the guests could turn away from. Every whisper, every glance, every shallow laugh carried the tension higher. Something was coming, something that would make this night unforgettable. And as Alexander raised his glass with mocking laughter, and Emily stood tall in her quiet strength, the first battle had begun. The room was bright and warm, but the air felt heavy. as if every guest was holding their breath waiting for what would happen next. Alexander King leaned back in his chair like a ruler on his throne, his smile sharp, his eyes fixed on Emily. He wanted the whole restaurant to see him as powerful, untouchable, someone who could bend others with a single word. He lifted his hand and snapped his fingers, the sound cutting through the quiet music like a whip, calling Emily back to his table as if she were not a human being but a servant he owned. Emily returned with calm steps. Though her stomach twisted inside, she held her tray steady. She stood tall even as her pulse raced. Alexander tilted his head and spoke loudly, louder than needed so that every person nearby could hear. He said, "Tell me, girl, what is your name?" His tone was mocking, and everyone knew that he already guessed she could not answer with voice. The guests nearby shifted in their seats, some with pity in their eyes, others with curiosity, waiting to see how cruel he could become. Emily raised her hands, her fingers moving gently, her sign saying, "My name is Emily." It was simple and clear, but Alexander leaned forward and narrowed his eyes, pretending to squint as if her hands were some strange, meaningless dance. He turned to his companions and laughed. His voice booming, he said, "What language is this?" Bird wings flapping in the air. The table erupted in laughter, their expensive watches flashing under the golden lights as their hands clapped the table. Emily's face warmed with embarrassment, her lips pressed tightly together, her heart pounded like a drum. She wanted to scream, but she had no voice. Still, her eyes stayed strong. She refused to look down. She refused to show tears. Her silence was not weakness, even if Alexander wanted it to look that way. She breathed slowly and signed again, "My name is Emily." But this time her hands moved firmer, sharper, filled with quiet power. Alexander smirked. He raised his voice even higher so the whole restaurant would hear. He said, "Dear guests, look at this. I ask a simple question and the girl waves her hands as if she is shooing away flies." His companions laughed again. One of them whispered loudly, "Maybe she is casting a spell." Another shouted, "Maybe she is calling birds to rescue her." The laughter grew crueler, the sound filling every corner of the room like dark smoke. The other guests who were not part of Alexander's group began to whisper. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Others stared at Emily with sympathy. But no one dared to speak against Alexander. He was too powerful, his name too heavy, his shadow too large. Yet inside every eye there was the same question. How would this silent waitress respond? Would she break? Or would she stand? Emily's hands trembled for a moment, but she clenched them tight. She steadied her breath, she lifted her chin. Her eyes locked on Alexander's face. She wanted him to know she was not afraid. Though her body screamed with nerves, she moved her hands again, this time slower, deliberate. The message in her signs was clear. "I will not be your joke." But Alexander leaned back with a fake dramatic gasp. Placing a hand on his chest as if insulted, he looked around at the guests and laughed louder. "Oh no, she is angry with me, look at that. The little mute girl is upset." His words stung like knives. The table of partners laughed even harder. Wine glasses shook in their hands, their eyes sparkling with amusement at her pain. Emily's skin burned, but her spirit did not bow. She turned to leave, but Alexander snapped his fingers again. A sharp, cruel sound that demanded her return, he said, "Not so fast, I am not finished. Bring me the finest wine, but bring it quickly. Let me see if your hands are good for serving at least." Since they are not good for speaking, Emily turned slowly, her face calm though her heart roared. She walked back to the counter, lifted the bottle with careful grace, and returned to the table. She poured the wine into his glass, her hands steady, her movements flawless. Not a single drop spilled. Her control was perfect, and the nearby guests noticed. Whispers spread again. Perhaps the girl was stronger than she seemed. Alexander raised the glass, took a slow sip, then looked at her with narrowed eyes, searching for weakness. He wanted her to tremble. He wanted her to break, but she stood unmoved, silent yet unyielding. His smirk faltered just a little, but he covered it quickly with another loud laugh. He said, "Still nothing to say. Still hiding behind those strange hand waves. Maybe you should find another job. Maybe cleaning streets, somewhere no one can see your shame." His words were sharp, his laughter harsh. Yet Emily only met his gaze with eyes that burned quietly, promising a fire that had not yet been seen. The restaurant grew colder under the golden lights. Silence stretched between the laughs, the tension rising like a storm waiting to break. Every guest felt it, every whisper carried it. Something was coming. And as Emily stood tall against the billionaire's cruelty, everyone knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a battle between wealth and dignity, between arrogance and silent strength. The golden lights of the restaurant flickered gently, but the air felt heavier than before. The laughter from Alexander's table still echoed, sharp and cruel, though some of it had begun to sound forced. The guests around the room could feel something strange growing, a tension like a storm cloud building slowly over calm waters. Alexander King leaned back in his chair, his smirk wide. His eyes fixed on Emily as though she were nothing more than entertainment. Yet behind the arrogance in his eyes there was a shadow of curiosity. He wondered why this silent girl was not breaking, why her face stayed calm when he wanted her to crumble. Emily stood near his table, her tray empty now, her hands folded together, her eyes steady. She had been humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, yet she did not bow. She did not run. She held herself like a tree standing against the wind. The whispers around the room grew louder. Guests leaned toward each other, some whispering pity for her, others murmuring shock at Alexander's cruelty. Still no one dared to speak against the billionaire. His power reached too far, his name too heavy, but in their eyes was something new. Respect for the silent waitress who refused to fall. Alexander tapped the glass with one finger. His voice cutting through the whispers, he said, "Still no words, still no sound. You live in silence, do you not feel small? Do you not feel useless?" He chuckled, then turned to his companions. "This is what happens when life forgets to give you a voice. You become invisible." Yet his laughter rang weaker now, as if he was trying too hard. His partners laughed with him, but some of their smiles looked uncertain. They shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the sharp edge in his cruelty. Emily took a deep breath. Her chest rising slowly, her eyes lifted, she signed again, her hands moving with grace, though she knew Alexander would pretend not to understand. Her message was quiet yet strong. "I am not invisible, I am not small." Her fingers shaped each word with strength. And though the billionaire only waved his hand dismissively, the guests who watched could feel something in her gestures, a silent fire that words could not capture. A woman at another table leaned close to her husband and whispered, "I think she is saying something powerful." The husband nodded, their eyes fixed on Emily's calm figure. Slowly, one by one, more guests began to notice, their curiosity growing stronger, their whispers circling like waves. What is she really saying? What is hidden in those silent movements? Alexander's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. He did not like that the crowd's attention was slipping away from his control. He raised his voice again, louder, forcing the focus back to himself. He said, "Enough of this silent play. Let us give her a challenge. Let us see if she can serve under pressure." He snapped his fingers again. His companions straightened with excitement. Like children ready for a cruel game, he ordered more food, demanding that Emily carry heavy trays alone and bring them fast without mistake. Emily bowed slightly, not in shame but in quiet strength, and walked away, her step steady. She returned soon carrying a tray piled high with dishes. The plates clinked softly. The weight was heavy, yet her arms held steady. The restaurant watched in silence. Alexander leaned forward, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for the sound of breaking glass. But Emily's movements were smooth, like water flowing without break. She placed each dish gently on the table. Not a single drop spilled. Her calmness shone like a quiet shield, and whispers of admiration spread once more. The billionaire's eyes narrowed. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. For a man who always won, this was unusual. This girl was not breaking. She was not crumbling. Instead, her silence was growing louder. Louder than his laughter. Louder than his cruelty. He tried again. He mocked her signs once more, lifting his hands and waving them like a clown. His companions laughed, but their voices cracked with unease. Some guests frowned openly now, shaking their heads. One whispered, "This is shameful." Another muttered, "This is not power. This is weakness." Emily felt the sting of his mocking, but she did not let it crush her. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes locked on him, her silence sharp as a blade, her hands clenched at her sides, ready. She could feel it inside her chest, a strength she had never needed to show before, a strength rising like fire through her veins. She knew the moment was coming when she would answer him in a way that no one could ignore. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Glasses remained untouched. Forks rested still on plates. Even the music in the background seemed too soft to matter. All eyes stayed fixed on the silent girl and the arrogant billionaire. The clash between them was no longer about food or service. It was something deeper. It was pride against dignity, noise against silence, cruelty against quiet strength. Alexander smiled once more, though his eyes betrayed his unease. He raised his glass and spoke louder than ever. He said, "Let us enjoy this evening. We have fine food, fine wine, and fine entertainment." His hand gestured toward Emily as if she were no more than a puppet on display. Laughter rose again from his companions, but it no longer filled the room. It echoed weakly against the rising silence of the crowd, and in that silence Emily stood stronger than ever, a storm waiting to break, a voice without sound ready to be heard. The golden room felt frozen, every guest waiting, every whisper fading into silence. Alexander King lifted his glass high as if he had won, his laughter booming across the tables. But behind that loud laugh his eyes showed a flicker of unease, because Emily still stood there silent yet unbroken, her calm eyes cutting through his arrogance like a quiet blade. He wanted her to collapse. He wanted her to be small, but she did not bend. She only stood taller, her breath steady, her hands at her side trembling, not with fear but with rising strength. Emily's heart raced like a drum in her chest. Her mind whispered to her, enough of being mocked, enough of being treated as less. Her whole life she had been silent, but her silence had never been weakness. Tonight it would be her greatest strength. The billionaire thought he had taken her dignity, but he had only given her the stage and she would use it. Not with voice, but with the language that was hers, the language of her hands, the language of her spirit. Slowly she lifted her hands, her fingers rising into the golden light, her movements sharp, graceful, filled with emotion. The air shifted as her hands began to speak, her eyes steady, her lips pressing tightly, her whole being focused. She signed words that carried fire, though no sound came. The message was clear to those who could understand. She signed, "You think money is power. You think noise is strength, but true power is respect, and respect is something you will never own." The restaurant gasped, not because they all understood, but because they felt it. They felt the weight of her movements, the fire in her eyes, the strength in her silence. At the corner of the room, a small boy stood up, his eyes wide. He was no older than 10. His mother tried to pull him back, but he shook his head and said loudly, "I can understand her. I know what she is saying." The room turned toward him, their curiosity exploding. The boy raised his voice so all could hear. "She says that a man's wealth cannot buy respect. She says that kindness is true strength. She says that you, sir, will never have that." Gasps filled the air. The guests looked at each other, their faces shocked, their eyes wide. Alexander's smirk vanished, his glass froze in his hand. For the first time his pride cracked. The echo of the boy's translation rolled across the golden hall like thunder. Emily's hands kept moving, her spirit pouring out through every sign. She continued, "I may be silent, but my silence is louder than your cruelty. I may not have money, but I have dignity. I may not have voice, but I have truth, and truth is something even a billionaire cannot crush." The boy shouted again, repeating her words, his young voice strong and bright. The guests leaned forward, their hearts racing, their admiration rising. The silence of Emily's life had been broken not by sound, but by meaning, and every person in that room could feel it. The shift was real, the atmosphere electric. Alexander's eyes darted around. He saw his business partners shifting in their seats, their laughter gone, their smiles faded, some of them looking down in shame, others looking away, afraid to meet the eyes of the girl they had mocked. Emily's hands moved faster now, her signs fierce, her message burning. She spoke with her body what her mouth could not. She signed, "You tried to make me small, but I stand tall. You tried to make me a joke, but tonight the joke is you. For a man with money who cannot show respect is poorer than the poorest beggar." Her hands stopped, her chest rising and falling. Her eyes locked on Alexander like arrows aimed straight at his pride. The boy translated with shining eyes, his voice carrying across the silent hall. He repeated every word, and when he finished, the restaurant erupted in gasps and whispers. Some guests clapped softly, others nodded with admiration. The sound spread like a wave, growing louder, stronger. Until it became applause, people stood from their seats, clapping harder, their voices rising, cheering for the girl who spoke without voice, the girl who had turned humiliation into victory. Alexander's hand shook, his glass slipping slightly. His pride was shattered in front of the very people he had wanted to impress. His face turned red with fury, but his mouth could not form words. His arrogance had been pierced. His power dimmed by silence, he rose slowly from his chair, towering over the table, his jaw clenched. But even his height and his wealth could not cover the truth that had just been spoken. He had been defeated not by noise, not by wealth, but by quiet dignity. Emily lowered her hands, her body calm now. Though her heart still raced, she bowed slightly to the boy who had been her voice, gratitude shining in her eyes. Then she turned back to Alexander, Her gaze steady, unafraid, she had answered him, not with words he could mock, but with truth he could not escape. And in that moment the balance in the golden room shifted forever. The billionaire who had tried to humiliate a waitress now stood humiliated himself, and the crowd knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. The golden restaurant had never felt so alive. Every table buzzed with whispers, gasps, and applause. The sound rolled across the room like thunder. The once soft music was drowned out by clapping hands and rising voices, all celebrating the courage of the silent waitress. Emily stood in the center, her hands still lowered, her chest rising with heavy breaths, her eyes calm but shining. Her strength was no longer hidden. It was glowing for all to see. She had spoken without a voice, and the world had listened. Alexander King remained frozen in his chair, his face pale, his jaw tight, his glass shaking slightly in his hand. This was the man who always had control, the man who ruled rooms with his wealth and his arrogance. Yet tonight he looked small, his smirk gone, his power slipping. The very crowd he had tried to impress was now against him. His business partners avoided his eyes, their fake smiles broken. Some shifted in their seats with shame. Others looked around nervously, as if searching for an escape from the storm they had helped create. The applause grew louder. Guests began to stand, their claps echoing off the golden walls. A woman near the front called out, "Bravo." Her voice ringing strong, another man shouted, "Well said," even though it was not said with sound but with hands. And soon the entire restaurant joined in, their voices blending with their cheers. The boy who had translated Emily's signs stood proudly beside his mother, his small face glowing with pride. He lifted his hands as if to honor Emily, shouting again, "She is right, she is brave," and the crowd agreed with him. Their cheers filling every corner. Emily bowed slightly, her eyes soft but her spirit steady. She had not wanted attention, she had not wanted to stand on a stage of humiliation, but she had been forced into it, and instead of breaking, she had risen. She had turned cruelty into strength. Now the crowd looked at her not as a waitress, not as someone small, but as someone powerful, someone who carried dignity greater than gold. Alexander's pride burned like fire. His cheeks flushed red. He slammed his glass down on the table. The sharp sound cracked across the applause. For a moment the clapping slowed, silence returning like a wave pulling back. He rose to his feet, towering over Emily. His eyes blazing with fury, he shouted, "Enough! This is nonsense. She is nothing. She is a servant." His words echoed, but they no longer carried the same weight. The guests frowned, some shaking their heads, others muttering in disgust. His voice, once feared, now sounded desperate. Emily did not move back. She did not flinch. She lifted her chin, her eyes locked on him. Her silence cut through his shouting like a knife. Her calmness made his rage look weak, and the crowd noticed. Whispers rose again, this time not against her, but against him. One guest whispered, "Look at him, shouting at a girl who cannot shout back." Another muttered, "This is no strength. This is shame." Alexander's business partners leaned toward each other, their eyes full of panic. One whispered, "He is ruining himself." Another nodded quickly. "If the press hears of this, it will destroy his reputation." But none of them dared to stop him. None of them dared to calm him. His temper was too dangerous, his pride too wild. Yet the damage was already spreading. Every guest with a phone was recording. Every whisper was carrying the story beyond the golden walls. The billionaire was losing his crown in real time. Emily lifted her hands once more, her fingers steady, her movements smooth. She signed slowly so all could see. Her message calm but strong. She said, "You tried to take my dignity, but you only gave me a stage. You tried to show me as weak, but you showed your own weakness. For a man who humiliates others only humiliates himself." The boy translated again, his young voice rising high. The crowd erupted once more in cheers and claps, louder this time, stronger, filling the room with waves of sound. Alexander's hand clenched into a fist. His eyes darted across the room, but everywhere he looked there were faces against him. No admiration, no fear, only judgment. His empire of pride was crumbling. His business partners looked down, their loyalty fading. They could see the tide turning. They could feel the weight of public opinion crashing down like a storm. The billionaire who had once silenced rooms with power was now silenced by the truth of a waitress who could not even speak. Emily stood tall, her hands lowering again, her eyes soft yet fearless. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to shout. The crowd had already chosen their side. The truth had already been spoken. Alexander's attempts to belittle her had only made her shine brighter. And the crowd, once silent and cautious, was now her shield, clapping, cheering, whispering her name, their energy lifting her higher. The golden restaurant that once belonged to Alexander's pride now belonged to Emily's strength. The applause shook the walls. The cheers rolled like thunder, and the billionaire stood in the center of it all. His arrogance cracked, his control slipping, his reputation hanging by a thread. He clenched his jaw, but his silence spoke louder than any word, for he had been defeated not by wealth, not by noise, but by the quiet courage of a girl he had tried to destroy. The golden restaurant was filled with thunderous applause, every guest on their feet, their voices rising like a wave that refused to end. Emily stood still in the center, her uniform plain, her hands calm at her sides, yet she looked like a queen, crowned not with jewels but with dignity, her silence brighter than any sound. The boy beside her smiled proudly, his young voice still echoing in the air. The guests clapped harder, cheering for the waitress who had turned humiliation into triumph. Alexander King stood tall but shaken, his face red, his jaw tight, his pride bleeding in front of the very crowd he had wanted to impress. He looked around the room searching for support, but none came. His business partners sat stiff, their eyes lowered, their smiles gone. The laughter that once followed his cruel jokes had vanished, replaced by whispers of disgust. Cameras from phones captured every angle, every second, his arrogance recorded for the world beyond these walls. Alexander knew this moment would follow him far outside the golden lights, and for the first time in his life he felt powerless. The applause began to soften, but the energy did not fade. It lingered in the air like fire. Emily lifted her hands again, her fingers moving slowly, her signs filled with calm. She spoke not to Alexander, but to everyone in the room. Her message steady and clear, she signed. Kindness is never weakness. Silence is never emptiness. Respect is greater than money. The boy translated once more, his young voice steady, repeating her words for all to hear. The guests clapped again, their cheers rising, tears shining in some eyes. The truth had been spoken. Alexander's hands clenched, his fists shaking at his sides, his lips pressed tightly. He could not find words. His arrogance had always been his armor, but tonight it was broken. He turned sharply, his chair screeching against the floor, the sound harsh in the glowing silence. He stormed toward the door, his steps loud, his shoulders tense. His business partners scrambled to follow, some calling after him in hushed voices, but he ignored them. He pushed through the doors and vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of his failure. The crowd watched him leave, then turned back to Emily, their faces filled with admiration. One woman stepped forward, clapping her hands high. She said, "You are stronger than all his money," her voice trembling with emotion. Others joined her, shouting words of praise, their voices overlapping in a chorus of respect. The boy beamed, pointing at Emily proudly, saying, "She is brave, she is not afraid." His words touched the hearts of everyone there, and the applause rose once more, not for a billionaire, but for a waitress who had shown true strength. The restaurant manager, who had stood frozen for so long, finally stepped forward, his face pale with shock and awe. He looked at Emily with wide eyes, then bowed his head slightly. He signed awkwardly with his hands. "Thank you." Though he did not know much sign language, his effort was clear, his gratitude shining. Emily bowed back politely, her eyes kind, her silence carrying more meaning than words ever could. Guests gathered around her, some offering kind smiles, others speaking words of praise. A man said, "You reminded us tonight that dignity is louder than pride." A woman whispered, "You gave hope to all who feel small." The boy's mother wiped tears from her eyes, hugging her son tightly, whispering, "Thank you for being her voice." The boy hugged back, his eyes never leaving Emily. He said, "She did not need me, she already spoke louder than all of us." Emily smiled softly, her eyes glowing under the golden lights. She had not planned to fight. She had not wanted to stand in the spotlight, yet fate had pushed her forward, and she had shown the truth of who she was. She had reminded everyone that silence is not weakness, that respect is greater than wealth, and that even the most arrogant voice can be silenced by quiet courage. Slowly, the restaurant began to return to motion. Waiters moved carefully again. Guests returned to their tables. Though their eyes often wandered back to Emily, their admiration still strong, their respect unshaken. The golden room felt different now, lighter, brighter, as if something heavy had been lifted. As if the cruel shadow of arrogance had finally left. Emily stepped outside into the cool night, the stars shining gently above her, the air fresh against her skin. She lifted her head, her lips curved in a soft smile, Her silence stretched out around her like a gentle song. She breathed deeply, her heart calm. Tonight she had been tested and she had answered not with fear, not with anger, but with truth. And that truth would live longer than any laugh, longer than any cruel word, longer even than wealth. The boy and his mother passed by on their way home. The boy waved excitedly, his small hands signing goodbye in a playful way. Emily smiled and signed back, her fingers graceful in the starlight. The boy grinned wide, then hurried off with his mother, leaving Emily standing quietly under the sky, the world around her alive, her spirit strong, her silence victorious, and so the night closed. The golden restaurant behind her still glowing, the whispers of her courage spreading far beyond its walls. Emily walked forward with steady steps, her dignity shining brighter than any jewel, her silence speaking louder than any voice, reminding all who had witnessed her strength that sometimes the greatest answer is the one spoken without sound, the one carried by truth, the one that can never be silenced.